Well, I can attest to how overwhelming this camera was when I first picked it up, just because of how there's just so much packed into this GH6, while seemingly coming off as just another regular Micro Four Thirds camera at first glance, while at the same time being very user-friendly, I must add. Kind of like the underdog of a world filled with the likes of other camera brands like Sony or Canon. And honestly, for that reason alone, I think I might just switch to Panasonic from Sony. But before I get into all of that, and before you start judging my taste comparing a Micro Four Thirds camera to a full frame camera, I must say that Panasonic just doesn't get enough credit about how they've made some really great focus video cameras, from its predecessor, the GH5 back in 2017, which already came with 10-bit 422, 4K 60 unlimited recording, 6K anamorphic external recording, and anamorphic D-squeeze display functions, 5-stop in-body stabilization, and not to mention the full frame line that Panasonic also makes from the S1 to the S5, which is on a whole other level of video features and something I hope we'll get into the future. Contrastingly to most cameras I've tried, I love how this GH6 is a video first camera. While it still does photo captures up to 75 frames with the electronic shutter, just from the interface itself, you can tell it's mainly made for video camera enthusiasts. But if you're keen to see how this holds up as a photographer's camera, we will be making a separate video on its photo capabilities, hosted by our community reviewer, Samantha. So stay tuned for that and subscribe if you haven't already for when that comes out. Okay, so specs of the GH6, and you might want to hold your breath because it is quite a lot to go through, and I will be mentioning it is going to be in PAL settings, not NTSC, because we are in Southeast Asia, and so that's 25 frames per second, not 24. With that out of the way, there's 3 different file formats of MP4, MOV, and also ProRes. ProRes being the latest addition to the GH6. MP4 formats will only get you up to 4K 50 at 100 Mbps and doesn't allow you to record at higher frame rates. This codec will definitely be the easiest on your PC or machine, as it deals with relatively small sizes and most likely the best format if you're trying to manage hard drive space. But where things get really interesting is when you switch to MOV or ProRes, which will unlock a plethora of codecs, aspect ratios, compression rates, and resolution options all the way up to 5.8K. And that's about 420 10-bit anamorphic. That's for the anamorphic modes. There is also a 4:3 aspect ratio, so you can de-squeeze that later on, but I won't be getting into much of anamorphic lenses because I just don't own any anamorphic lenses. I will be linking some of the more affordable anamorphic lenses if you want to find out more about those. There's of course 4K 25, 422, 10-bit, and up to 4K 100 FPS, and Cinema 4K with a slightly wider aspect ratio at 17:9, ranging from 25 frames per second, 10-bit 420, up to 100 frames at 300 megabits per second. I think for the sake of this review, I'll be shooting mostly in 4K 25, 420, 10-bit. I mean, just to manage the post-production side a little bit easier. Just to mention, just to touch a bit on the Apple ProRes. Yeah, this this setting will set you back about 1 gig every 4 seconds, especially if you're recording 422 HQ. Bearing in mind that this codec does take a lot of space. So definitely something to be mindful of if you're recording in these formats. In comparison to the GH5, GH5 does feel like it's not too far behind. There is a lot of what is inside the GH6, there's still a lot inside the GH5. But just about the ergonomics and the functionalities that you can customize to your settings and the extra buttons you get on the side here. Yeah, these can be customized to your liking, and also a new record button, an extra record button on the bottom left side of the body, and better heat sinks. So there's now a new fan on the side here, and also the tilting of our screen that's somewhat like the Sony's, and of course your flip out screens. So I love the fact that there is some options of how you place your screen to whatever angle that you want, and yeah, just it looks just more refined. It feels more updated, of course, and it doesn't exactly resemble the size of a S1 or S5, but I've yet to test those cameras out, so I can't really say for sure. But one thing I am very stunned and very amazed about is the stabilization, the 5-axis in-body stabilization, and there's also electronic stabilization if you want to boost that up. But just from the comparison of the GH5 and the GH6, both did relatively well in terms of stabilization, and I couldn't find any warping effects until I get to the post-production side, or once I blow this up on a big screen, which we will get to in a bit. And before I forget, I just want to mention Micro Four Thirds sensors. It might get confusing to some that it is showing a 12 to 16 millimeter, and this is because it's a double crop factor. So we are looking at a 24 to 120 mil. So far, I'm loving the lens on this. This is the kit lens that comes with the camera. So far, I'm just stunned about how video focused wise these cameras are as compared to most other brands like Sony. Sony is very living into that hybrid aspect, especially the A7 IIIs, the A7 IVs. And one thing that I found out about the A7 IV was that it only took V90 cards and above if you wanted to shoot in high frame rates or to access a higher codecs. But this, surprisingly, even though there is a CF Express Type B card, it still takes in normal SD cards. I was still able to capture as much footage as I can using both of these cards, so that's already a big plus for me. And yeah, as much as this is somewhat of a hybrid camera, it doesn't really have that satisfying physical shutters when I'm taking photos. I think at the start of this review I mentioned that I'm not going to be focusing so much on photos, but yesterday I did have a try taking a bit of photos of this artist called Lisolme, and indoors it's what you expect out of a 25 megapixel sensor. I just want to go through a few points about the software and also the functionalities that's within the body of the GH6. And part of them was, I have to mention the waveforms, because having waveforms on a video camera helps out so much in capturing just the right amount of highlights and shadows, just because it gives you a visual representation of what you're seeing through a graph. These are one of the functionalities I wish I had in the Sony, but thankfully there is one in here. But also a metering spot, which allows you to pinpoint different highlight points in the frame, so you can adjust manually for whatever focal point you have you choose from. And I believe that will be very, very useful in terms of products or macro shots, just being able to pinpoint certain points. The main features that I've seen right on top of the camera is a built-in sound record level limiter. So all you gotta do is just press this button over here, and it will show you a menu system of the channels that's available, and you can even choose for which channel, either first channel or second channel, or even choose both channels. And I leave in that record setting just because I can edit them in post. But if you're interested in actually applying this with a XLR adapter, there is a 4-channel external adapter you can get online, and that can be compatible by using the hot shoe mount. And yeah, going back to the SS gain operation, this I found to be the most useful, mainly because switching from different frame rates, if you're shooting in high frame rates, then you have to adjust the shutter speed. But here you can just choose an
an angle, which is usually 180 degrees. So that's one less worry you got to think about when you're trying to manage highlights and exposures correctly. But the other main useful UI that I've been able to see is the fact that the battery is showing minutes instead of percentage. I mean, sometimes you just gotta know like how long you have left, and that kind of battery display lets you, manage your time better when it comes to shoots. And just the overall simple menu system that Panasonic has done very well at. I'm not sure if I mentioned about how different it is from the GH5, but there is a lot of improvements in the way it's just organized, and it's much easier to understand. If you have troubles of understanding what all of these settings mean, there is also an extra display function where by just pressing on, let's say, let's record file format, what does that do? So all you gotta do is just press the display function and it will tell you what it really is. I mean, just small little bits like that makes a user-friendly interface, and I love how they thought about the smallest things. And I've been using the Sony for years, and there's still some settings inside there that I still don't understand. So I'm glad that they have that small feature just so you can take time to understand your camera. And I think that's very useful for anyone who isn't familiar with the Lumix platform, and all those who just have never actually understood their camera as much as they should. But I'm gonna do some comments about the image quality. Yeah, let's move on to that. Okay, so I do want to touch a bit on the image quality coming from the GH6. I do want to touch first on the 5-axis in-body stabilization. This test footage here is using the Sigma lens, the 18-35 Sigma lens with the Metabones adapter. Yeah, this does not have any stabilization on the lens. So the test footage I'm showing you guys here is when it's completely turned off. So obviously you will have very shaky footage, and with IBIS turned on, slightly smoothens it out, but once all of that together plus with the boost stabilization, it just cleans everything up very, very well, and even up to a point of just using the kit lens, the 12-60, meaning a 24-120 mil. With the OIS turned on, it almost kind of resembles using a gimbal. But yeah, I'm walking here, and it's very, very stable to even up to a point where I'm shooting very low to the ground, just because it gave me that confidence that I will be getting stable footage no matter how low I get. I do want to move on to how it performs in daylight and comparatively to the GH5. As an example here, a discovery I found was basically that the GH5 only was able to shoot at ISO 200, and it couldn't go lower than that. So the footage from here, this is the GH6. As you can see, the trees at the back here, it was exposed properly, but going into the GH5 test footage, yeah, this is color corrected with the highlights turned down. But if I were to leave that at a normal setting, it was slightly blown out and overexposed. But as the GH5's stabilization improvement-wise, there have been some annoyances where I found it to be a bit too warpy. Like it had that warping effect, just because of how electronic stabilizations outputs always tend to look. It kind of makes things jelly in some ways. But in terms of dynamic range, even especially shooting in vlog, this is graded to Rec 709, and I love how flattering the skin tones look in this color profile, and especially in shooting 4K 422 10-bit. very true to life, and it feels very effortless to grade. And yeah, even up to this point, I would say is a good reference of high dynamic range, is just because some cameras might struggle capturing the window frames and might blown out, might overexpose the window frames. But in this case, it was very clean, and you could even see still see the trees in some way at the back there. But yeah, I just love how the colors look from the Vlog. Even at low light, even shooting in low light using Vlog. Looked noisy at first, but cleaned up very evenly. And even in situations when the subject, like here, is backlit with a very bright light source at the back, and foreground being filled with shadows or blacks, still looks very clean. And if I were to give a better example of how good it performed in low light, cinema 4K, shooting in cinema 4K, low light, f2.8, relatively quite wide, but I'm looking at the sky here and the darker parts of the image, it looks very clean. And in some points when the only light source was in the middle of the frame, like here where the Aeon's big sign is, and it looks very clean. There's barely any noise that I can see from shooting this low light. Yeah, I've been in situations where I kind of left it in shutter priority, sorry, and yeah, it's still managed with the shadows very well, which is surprising coming from a Micro Four Thirds camera. But if you were to push the ISO a bit too far, like for instance in this example, I kind of pushed it a bit too far at 6400 ISO, and it got very noisy. Yeah, the GH6 does have a dual native ISO 400 to 2500, and once you push it above 2500, and that's when it starts to suffer a bit more. So try not to push it too far in terms of ISO. At least from my experience using the Sonys that have a dual native ISO of 800 to 12800, so I'm kind of spoiled with the Sony low light performance, but it still relatively performed very well, especially in cinema 4K when you have that slightly bit more resolution. In terms of daylight testing, there's not much to compare it to the GH5, because unless you're very peaking at 400%, then probably you might find huge differences. But in terms of color outputs, they perform quite similar. It looks definitely a lot more cleaner in the GH6, of course. Just new sensor maybe, and yeah, the GH5 that I got to borrow was pretty banged up. If you're seeing the B-roll I'm playing on right now, yeah, it was really beat up. And this is a new GH6, so possibly that could play a role in how the final output came out to be here. But yeah, I don't want to get into too much of the my comments on the image quality, because you know, a subjective topic anyways. But in terms of just how user-friendly the camera was, I picked this camera up with barely to no experience using a Lumix platform, and my first time using it was actually for an interview at an event, a Huawei event, and it served to be my main camera because this camera's battery ran out, so I only had this camera where I had no experience using it, and it was very easy to get to know and easy to just operate, and got me to do my job. So in situations like that, where some cameras might be daunting to start off with, especially if it's video first cameras. Usually hybrid cameras are easier to understand, but in this case, a video first camera like the GH6 or GH5 before it. I sometimes wonder why I didn't start off with this platform because it has just so much functionality. Pricing wise, with the lens, mentioning in ringgit right now, I did find the price for it to be, I think 12,800 ringgit. So I will be putting an actual price in dollars here of the GH6. Yeah, it's just a very user-friendly camera, and on top of the 5.7K Apple ProRes capabilities and Anamorphic waveforms, 2 types of articulating screens, this little stuff like having manual servo, and I think I mentioned this already, just the usability of how the buttons are all placed on the body itself just makes you feel confident in using a video camera like this. Those are my overall thoughts about the GH6, and I do hope that we get to try out more of the full frame cameras that Panasonic does, like the S1 or the S5, but only time will tell before that. I don't want to push this video for too long, and yeah, thank you so much for waiting till the end, and see you guys in the next video.